Varadkar. And at that time, Leo Varadkar said that he would give full and meaningful consideration to the request for the extension. Taoiseach, your programme for government commits to extend paid parental leave for parents to allow them to spend more time with their baby during the first year. And although your language is very vague, it does raise the expectation that your government will now act. Extending maternity leave and pay is the right thing to do. I mean, particularly in these times of public health emergency, times where women have given birth without their partner present, where they've faced the first few months of motherhood without access to the usual important supports, where the disruption caused by the COVID-19 crisis has consumed time that should have been about the mother and her new baby. And the peace that usually characterises this important time has been replaced by immense levels of stress, as you know, Taoiseach. So COVID-19 has had a real effect on these families, and it's been my view for quite some time that the maternity leave in this state is not fit for purpose. The scheme is unfair, it's outdated, but perhaps that's a discussion for another day as to how we remedy that. But for now, Taoiseach, I'm asking you to confirm that your government will do the right thing and that you will extend maternity leave and maternity pay for the 12 weeks requested.
Thank you very much. Taoiseach.
Thank you, Deputy, for the question. And indeed, I am conscious that Deputy Breed-Smith did raise this with the outgoing Taoiseach and now Taoiseach Leo Varadkar some time ago in the context of the very significant impact on women, and particularly those on maternity leave, that COVID-19 has had, particularly in terms of the normal supports, access to childcare, baby groups and so on, that was denied mothers during this critical period. And Adaviam, Gubel Brew, Agus Gorev Brew File, Erna Mano, Egohex, on virus Coronach. Ní éon áras ach go raibh sin an scéal, agus tá an rialtas ag déanamh scrúdú ar an gceist, níl sé simplí, tá anna cuid laistigh den ceist, agus go háire ó thaobh réiteach na ceiste tá roinnt le déanamh fós. So the Department of Justice and Equality has the policy responsibility for maternity leave, while social protection pays the benefit. Now, this matter is being examined by government, and there is consultation between the Minister for Social Protection, the Minister for Justice and Equality, although that department is breaking up, and indeed, obviously, the Department of Public Expenditure. I want to point out that the retrospective nature of what is proposed may create legal and policy difficulties. For example, some of the women who have exhausted their maternity benefit are now back at work or indeed on the pandemic unemployment benefit. And obviously other stakeholders are involved, and there will be consultation with other stakeholders in relation to this, particularly employers obviously who are facing challenges as well in terms of COVID-19. In that context then, and I spoke to the ministers yesterday, they are engaged now in consultations on this issue. And what I can say to the Deputy that it's our intention to come back with a very considered response shortly in relation to this issue and to deal with the matters that I've outlined to you.
Deputy MacDonald.
Well, then, Taoiseach, we are of one mind. We all recognise that those women and couples that have had children in this period have faced very considerable difficulties and stress without all of the normal supports that new parents generally enjoy when they bring home their newborn. I actually think this is a very straightforward ask. I don't believe, Taoiseach, you should hide behind a veil of complexity. The simple facts are that these women need additional time, they need additional leave, and they need to be sure that that additional leave will be paid leave. To me, it is very, very straightforward, not least because childcare provision now is so under stress, and there's no certainty for many parents that they will be able to get adequate and appropriate childcare, particularly for newborn infants. So, Taoiseach, can I ask you again to act swiftly? I do understand that the Minister for Justice had, in the last government, some jurisdiction on these issues. Of course, equality has been moved now to a different department, so neither do I want this issue to get lost in the labyrinth or the bureaucratic machinations of the new government. This isn't a time for delay. This is a time now for timely action. The matter, of course, is time sensitive. Because many women are now on maternity leave. They're looking at the prospect and the pressure of returning to work. So I'm asking you, Taoiseach, as your first act in government, act now, make a clear decision on this matter, act fairly and do the right thing by Irish women and these new mothers.
Taoiseach, to conclude on this matter.
It is our intention to do the right thing, but to do it in a considered way. It's not as simple as the Deputy has outlined. And there are complexities involved in relation to it, both legal and policy. The estimated cost is about 78 million, which would affect about 24,500 women. So that is being considered by the relevant government departments. And I don't intend to come in here and just say what might be popular or just give a very simple affirmative response. I want to see a considered response from the departments concerned. It will come to government, and obviously we will influence that, and government will make a decision in relation to it, bearing in mind all of the wider issues that you've alluded to as well. And the programme for government does give very clear commitments in terms of improving the situation around maternity leave, paternity leave and so on, and in terms of the wider strategy designed to improve the quality of life of mothers, particularly after their babies are born as well.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Alan Kelly, please.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, I think you've probably had the shortest honeymoon period of any incoming Taoiseach in the history of the state. I think it lasted, in fairness to you, about 2 hours before some of your own colleagues started turning on you. And it has continued for the last week and a half since, even up to today. Now, I do appreciate that you are only a week and a half in the job, but you're not a newcomer to politics. You're one of the most experienced people in here. So there is a reasonable expectation that you're going to hit the ground running and that you're going to provide stability and a clear direction for the people. Instead, you've had to manage a huge amount of unrest, commencing with your own party and open criticism. And one of your ministers, as we now know, has had to apologise to you and has to apologise quite publicly for his driving ban while on a provisional licence, and no doubt we'll just deal with that later on and hopefully get full clarity. In the same week, your Minister for Health has stood over an interview where he admitted taking illegal drugs. So no doubt this needs to be teased out by you and further as well. Then one of your MEPs ignored the requirement for quarantine when you travelled to your inauguration. So, Taoiseach, I have to ask you, now that you're back in government, are Fianna Fáil public representatives above the law again and above public health advice? You do come from old Fianna Fáil politics, but based on the government's first week, it hasn't been a good week. I know internally you'd have to think that yourself, because the modus operandi looks like it's back to an old style of couture politics. I'm not sure how your colleagues in government are going to take this style. But what kind of public example does it give when 3 senior Fianna Fáil representatives have openly flouted the law and public health rules? On top of this, we had the leaders of one of the opposition parties in this chamber, in the case of Sinn Féin, breaking all social distancing rules to attend to an IRA funeral and rally, as it turned out, in Belfast. And this was the second time that members of the party attended a funeral during the COVID lockdown, while everyone else had to respectively stay at home as friends neighbours and supporters were laid to rest. People might, in fairness, expect the practice of exceptionalism from Sinn Féin, but I think, Taoiseach, the public may have thought that Fianna Fáil have been humbled since they led the government during the crash. Then the first act of the new Minister for Education was to bellow about, suddenly, a new grant, an extension, going on to a school in her own constituency, despite us being in the middle of the biggest educational crisis in the history of the state. So Fianna Fáil are certainly back, and back in power. Taoiseach, this country needs a stable government, not more of this. So it has to end this week. People are rightly concerned about whether or not they can return to work. They are rightly concerned about whether the health service will resume soon, when schools will reopen, and they want to know if they'll be able to deal with rent and mortgage arrears. When will you be in a position to provide the people with a clear statement on all 4 of those issues, and to ensure that they will have a plan in place for the summer months and for September in particular?
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
First of all, I don't accept your analysis of the first week of government. You can talk about internal party issues, you can talk about issues pertaining to certain individuals, but my focus has been unwavering since I was elected Taoiseach in that first week. And the focus has been on policy and substance from the very beginning. We have a very extensive legislative programme for this month, as the Business Committee is well aware. I'd say unprecedented in terms of the amount of legislation we'll try and get through the House to deal with the COVID-19 impact on the economy, whether it's the Micro-Enterprise Loan Fund Agreement Bill, the Financial Provisions COVID-19 Bill, the Credit Guarantee Amendment Bill, Ministries and Secretaries Amendment Bill to set up the Department of Higher Education and Research, and the various other, the establishment of all the Cabinet subcommittees have already been established by the government. I spent a week speaking to the President of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, to the President of the EU Council, Charles Michel, to Michel Barnier in relation to Brexit, to Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, to Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, all around the European Recovery Fund, and also in relation to the multi-annual financial framework, and also in terms of how Europe as an entity deals with Brexit and the Irish position on it. So I've been very focused. Other stuff goes on, as it always has in politics, and we will deal with that too. But from the government perspective, the government has to be focused on the people. And in respect of the questions that you asked in relation to the schools reopening and in terms of the travel advice, you know, we did spend the last week, we had a special COVID subcommittee on Friday to deal with international travel. And we had an extensive consultation with government colleagues, and we came down and we announced the decision yesterday that the existing advice would continue, that we advise against unnecessary travel abroad in the interests of public safety and in the interests of suppressing the virus, and above all to help us to get schools open in September. It's a passion of mine that we get the schools open in September because a child's development rests on it, and we limit the life chances of children if we deprive them any longer of schooling and of education. So the Cabinet COVID Committee will meet again to discuss that issue now that we've dealt with the international travel, and will then now focus in on education and engaging with the education authorities in terms of returning to school. And the other area, and I met with the Minister for Health last evening and with the Acting Secretary-General of the Department of Health to focus in on the non-COVID strand of disease, illnesses, the need for diagnostics, to get resumption of services, now that critical care beds have been freed up as a result of the suppression of the virus itself, and that the number of critical care beds have been, the number of patients in critical care beds have been significantly reduced. So I haven't wasted an hour since I was elected Taoiseach to concentrate on the fundamentals that face the Irish people. And no politician is above the law, and no politician should be above the law. And in respect of Minister Cowan, you will note that punishment was meted out in respect of his transgression 4 years ago.
Kelly.
Thank you, Taoiseach. I know from your reply, I was delighted that you referenced so often that not 1 hour has been wasted. You've been very, very focused. You've gone into an awful lot of detail, you said it numerous times, and specifics. So I want to ask you one question. There are hundreds of thousands of people worried about their livelihoods. And as policymakers, and you have your July stimulus coming forward, as policymakers, we as legislators don't have the information we need to plan for this crisis. The CSO report that just over 131,000 people are unemployed at the end of June, which is the seasonally adjusted traditional unemployment figure of 5.8%. However, at the same time, they report a COVID-19 adjusted unemployment rate of 22.5%. There is a world of difference between both figures. Now, I don't want figures to be massaged. So, given all the work and specific, detailed work, and there hasn't been an hour wasted, I'm sure that today, on the 7th of July, you have the capacity to confirm, to the best of your knowledge, to be fair, what is the real unemployment rate as of today.
Deputy Taoiseach.
In terms of the COVID figure is the one that I take as my yardstick in terms of the unemployment rate, in terms of the reality of the situation in terms of many, many people. And of course, in terms of those supports, the job stimulus programme will focus on both that area, but also on the wage subsidy scheme, which has protected thousands and thousands of jobs. And it does remain unclear, maybe we can get into all sorts of statistics, but in terms of how many companies will be viable over time. Many, many companies have been protected and are protected by the wage subsidy scheme. And part of the July stimulus programme will be to reevaluate that scheme, to fine-tune it. No one will come off a cliff as a result of any decisions or policy decisions. But the July job stimulus is aimed, again, not just to protect jobs, but to create additional jobs. And I think it's going to be an uncertain time ahead in terms of the employment situation. There are various estimates made by the various bodies that project in terms of employment figures and so on. I hope some of them are realised in terms of a significant reduction by the end of the year. But I think it's fair to say to all concerned that supports will be necessary to the medium term, but also initiatives will have to be taken to create jobs, create alternative opportunities, particularly for young people.
Catherine Murphy, please.
We know from the number of clusters and the number of deaths from COVID-19 in the nursing home sector, just how exposed the sector was and the tragic consequences that followed. At the height of the crisis, the lack of preparedness within the sector was raised in this House on numerous occasions. We heard of concerns raised by Nursing Home Ireland. Those concerns were raised as early as the beginning of March. Concerns about safe and appropriate discharges from acute hospitals to nursing homes. Concerns about staff and people being recruited to work in the health service at the expense of the nursing home sector, with the risk raised that it would endanger older people. Concerns were raised about clarity over PPE, testing, etc. Yesterday in the Irish Times, through Freedom of Information, more information came into the public domain. We found out that senior HSE officials were privately raising major concerns about coronavirus hitting nursing homes in March, with one flagging their totally inadequate preparation and another saying it was the biggest live risk for the health service. We found out that agency staff were being supplied to nursing homes at double cost where they were available. Safe Ireland has raised serious concerns about the care of the late Mr Ultan Meehan, a nursing home resident from County Meath, after he was admitted to Connolly Hospital, and the care home was unable to manage his care for a facial wound that came badly infected. My questions are, Taoiseach, will you commit to ensuring that Mr Meehan and his wife, or Mr Meehan's wife, Mary, is given a full report? It could be done by the by HICWA or by the expert panel. Other questions are, the former Minister for Health, Simon Harris, established a COVID committee for the nursing home sector. It's an expert panel on the 23rd of May. It was supposed to report by the end of June. Has that happened? If not, when is it likely to happen? The changes to the temporary assistant payment scheme to nursing homes was amended last week by the Minister for Health. It reduces the overall amount. Is that because of an income-related issue? Is it funding, or was there a rationale for doing that? If that rationale has been produced, will you provide it to the Dáil? Do you believe that clinical governance should remain the responsibility of the nursing home sector? If not, who should have responsibility, and how quickly can that be put in place? And finally, Taoiseach, you were one of the people in opposition who was raising some of the concerns about the nursing home sector. How concerned are you now that what is emerging in the public domain about this sector and how exposed it was? How satisfied are you on your watch that should another outbreak occur, that this sector is fully prepared?
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
Thank you very much, Deputy, for your question. And first of all, I would empathise with a lot of what you have said in terms of the challenges that faced the nursing home sector at the outset of COVID-19. And I don't believe it was adequately prepared at that time to cope with the pandemic. And in my view, a lot has been learned since then, and the expert panel has been set up by the former minister. My understanding is that should report within the next fortnight, and that certainly will be an important basis to evaluate policy in the next number of months. I would also point out that there is a very comprehensive testing now going on in nursing homes right now in relation to the prevalence of the virus. In one nursing home, just for your information, 5 people would have had the virus asymptomatic. So that illustrates, even now, with the suppression of the virus, the challenges that are clearly still there within the nursing home sector. In terms of the clinical governance issue, I'd like to obviously be guided by the report of the expert panel, but I think we've learned enough from the experience during COVID-19 to actually accept that changes have to take place in and around the governance of the nursing home sector, particularly on the clinical side, and a stronger, in my view, clinical oversight will be required. That's a view I would have in relation to that. And in terms of the case Mary Butler, Mrs. Marty Butler-Meehan Mary Butler-Meehan has raised, I'm very concerned about that case. I do believe HICWA is the regulating authority for the nursing home sector, and I do believe Mrs. Meehan is entitled to a report at the very least, and the case should be reviewed from what I've read of it. And I've sought from the Department of Health a further update in relation to that particular case. It is very worrying indeed in terms of Mrs. Butler-Meehan's own experiences when she visited. She lost both her son, Adrian, and her husband. And it's a very, very traumatic, shocking situation, which I think deserves a comprehensive response and a full response for Mary Butler herself and her family. And I think that should be done. In terms of its future preparation and preparedness for any resurgence, I think the testing exercise that's currently underway I think is something I take solace from, in the sense that it's the desire of the HSE and the health authorities to be on top of this, and the public health authorities to be on top of the nursing home sector in terms of making sure that it's not caught off guard, perhaps as it was at the outset of COVID, which was an unprecedented global pandemic. If you remember at the beginning, all concerns around the acute hospital side and the nursing home side, I think came a bit later in terms of attention.
I'll take it then, Taoiseach, that you'll be talking to HICWA to make sure that that report is done and will be produced for that tragic case. The reduction in the funding, you didn't address that issue. Would you address that in your response? And if there is a report or an evaluation, that will be provided to the Dáil. Are you surprised by the kind of warnings that were coming from senior officials in HICWA or in the HSE that had a responsibility? Very serious concerns being raised. Are you concerned that they didn't come into play earlier, because they were being raised at the beginning of March? You know, some of this was being raised, and including from Nursing Home Ireland, they were being raised at the same time as NEFIT were saying that there wasn't a requirement to isolate nursing homes from visitors. So it was at a very early stage. Does that surprise you? Because this has been raised, and in fact, I think we'd all feel that we were a bit dismissed when we raised the issue about what we were seeing in nursing homes. And will that be something that will be looked at by the expert committee, those concerns particularly?
In terms of I think the temporary assistance payment you raise and the funding issue, I think we have to accept that when a global pandemic of this scale emerges, and it's once in 100 years, lessons have to be learned from it. And I believe there should be comprehensive reviews of everything that took place, but with a view to lessons and not trying to, damn people or apportion particular blame. I think the exercise has to be about learning lessons. Why? Because if it happens again, we need to be able to respond better and more effectively. And because we don't want future public health officials, future public servants, hamstrung by the fact that, there might be another inquiry into what I'm doing now in the middle of this crisis. All international responses to crisis have that as a basic standard, actually, that we look back to learn, you evaluate, you learn, and you make sure you apply those lessons to future pandemics or to future crises. That's a general philosophy I would have. That said, I think obviously those concerns, the fact that senior people raised those concerns is concerning, although the system did respond. Now, the biggest issue, I think, early on was PPE. The other issue was, and we need to, like public health officials will still say to you, that it may not necessarily have been visitors coming into the nursing home that was the primary conduit of the virus or cause of the transmission of the virus, that there were other factors as well. And the current testing is beginning to throw some light on that as well at the moment.
Taoiseach, the last time yourself and your party were in government faced with a major crisis, back then caused by the greed of bankers and developers, working people got it in the neck. Hundreds of thousands lost their jobs, saw pay cuts, and a decade of austerity followed. Now, I think for most people, the test as to whether you have changed and that you are going to be the government of change that people voted for on February the 8th is how working people fare under your government. And a key and immediate litmus test for whether you are going to bring that change and whether ordinary working people are going to get a fair deal and the support they need under your government faced with another crisis is the situation faced by 1,500 Debenhams workers who have been out protesting after Debenhams treated them in the most despicable way by, without consultation, without notice, moving the company to liquidation in April of this year, company who has refused to negotiate at all with the workers and which is orchestrating a situation, even though there are probably tens of millions worth of stock in the shops in Henry Street, in Blackrock, in Cork, in Tala and Blanchardstown, apparently this is a company with no assets. And of course, this is because conveniently the company lent itself, one of its subsidiaries, lent itself some money and made the Irish business a co-guarantor on money that it lent to itself, eliminating all assets effectively from the balance sheet of the company. Now, that is despicable treatment of workers. And the question is, because you said you were focused on legislation, Taoiseach, what are you going to do in order to support these Debenhams workers? And what needs to happen is that Debenhams cannot be allowed siphon off assets as they are trying to do to prevent a fair redundancy deal for these workers. The legislation to reorder the priority creditors in situations of liquidation has to be amended immediately so that workers in this situation are not treated in this despicable way, as was done with Cleary's workers before. This issue has been well flagged, that where companies are contravening employment legislation or treating workers in this way, they will suffer serious penalties for treating people in this way, and that you will use all the sections available to your government in the Companies Act, particularly section 599 and 608, to make sure that the company does not run off with the assets and the workers get the fair redundancy and decent treatment that they deserve. In conjunction with the Debenhams workers, we are this afternoon putting a motion to the effect of what I've just outlined on the order paper of the Dáil. And they are hoping that your government and all parties in here will support that motion and take those actions necessary to get a just settlement for these women workers who are out, as we speak, picketing to prevent the assets being physically taken out of Henry Street by a cynical company that has treated them with contempt.
I think Debenhams have treated the workers very, very poorly and in a very shabby way. And were wrong to do so. And you are correct in saying they've availed of the legal framework within the Companies Act, solvency is winding up, governing all of that, to leave the workers extremely short, and the state, through statutory redundancy, will essentially have to do its bit to provide within the law, and within the framework, what the state can provide in terms of statutory redundancy. But it is unacceptable. And yes, in my view, the legislation would have to be re-examined in terms of the devices that companies may use, separating out assets from trading income in particular, to deprive workers of their just entitlements in relation to redundancies. It's not simple, because any reform of any legislation can have unintended consequences. But in the programme for government, that issue is referenced, and it is an area that work will commence in terms of examining the overall company law situation with a view to reducing capacity of companies to deny workers their entitlements in terms of redundancy and workers' rights generally when a company is winding up. And that it happened in the context of COVID-19, I think was particularly regrettable. That the sense is that the COVID-19 situation was used as a basis for closing the company and leaving 1,500 people out of work.
Lloyd Barrett.
Your words, and I'm sure the Debenhams workers will welcome your words of sympathy and your condemnation of how Debenhams have treated them. But the test is, what are you going to do about it? We need to act urgently to do everything we can to make sure that Debenhams do not get away with manipulating the law as it stands in order to siphon off these assets. Their failure to consult with workers, the fact that the state may have to pay out the statutory redundancy, gives us certain leverage under that legislation for the insolvency fund to go after the assets of Debenhams, and we should do that. They've tried to siphon those assets off, but because of the heroic protests of those workers, and I have to say, there are really echoes of the South Africa Dunn Stores strike battle on those picket lines, and I'd encourage you to go down and meet with them, because the women are an absolute inspiration, and they are not going away. They are going to fight for justice. So I would appeal to you and your government to do absolutely everything now to ensure justice for them. The assets are in those shops. Debenhams must not be allowed to take them out. And those assets should be liquidated to the benefit of the workers to ensure just settlement for them. And there is a lot at stake. I'll just conclude on this, Count Corlett. There's a lot at stake, because this isn't just about Debenhams workers. We are facing potentially tens of thousands of similar redundancies. So this is a test. Are we going to stand with workers faced with this kind of treatment and possibilities of mass redundancies in this country to prevent that sort of shoddy treatment and to protect workers who've given decades of loyal service as these workers have?
Thank you, Deputy. Again, I'm not going to raise expectations that one cannot deliver on in terms of legislative in terms of interfering in the liquidation process or having interventions which would not sustain legally. So in terms of the existing workforce, the liquidation process, and how we can leverage the remaining assets to secure the rights of workers, that's a very challenging and complex issue. You know that deep down. I accept your bona fides, obviously, of course, in terms of what you want to happen on behalf of the workers, and I understand where you're coming from in relation to that. But I think there are two dimensions to this. One is, how can we support in the most practical way the workers themselves who have been laid off? And how do we prevent the exploitation, if you like, of the company's legal framework, the law framework, to prevent such exploitation of workers into the future? And how we can build in greater protections for workers in such eventualities that they would have greater claims, clawbacks in terms of closures of this kind, engineered in this way into the future. And that's what I certainly would like to examine with my colleagues in government.
Thank you, Taoiseach. And that concludes Leaders' questions. We've run a bit over time, but it's our first day. Perhaps from now on we might stick to the allocated time. Taoiseach, I understand that you have an announcement to make for the information of the House in relation to the appointment of ministers and ministers of state.
Ceann Comhairle, I beg leave to announce for the information of the Dáil, one, that having informed the President that Dáil Éireann had approved my nomination of deputies to be members of the Government, the President on the 27th of June 2020 appointed them accordingly. That on the same date I nominated Deputy Leo Varadkar to be the Taoiseach and assigned the Department of Business Enterprise and Innovation to him. That on the same date I assigned the other Departments of State to the other members of Government as follows: the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment and the Department of Transport, Tourism and Sport to Deputy Eamon Ryan, the Department of Finance to Deputy Pascal Donoghue, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform to Deputy Michael McGrath, the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht to Deputy Catherine Martin, the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government to Deputy Dara O'Brien, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Department of Defence to Deputy Simon Coveney, the Department of Education and Skills to Deputy Norma Foley, the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection and the Department of Rural and Community Development to Deputy Heather Humphreys, the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine to Deputy Barry Cowan, the Department of Children and Youth Affairs to Deputy Roderick O'Gorman, the Department of Justice and Equality to Deputy Helen McEntee and the Department of Health to Deputy Stephen Donnelly. 4, that these assignments have been made pending completion of the necessary processes for the establishment of the new departments and for transfers of functions that I announced in the House last week, and that Deputy Simon Harris is a member of the Government without portfolio pending completion of these processes. That on the 27th of June 2020, the President appointed Paul Gallagher SC as Attorney General. That on the same date, the Government appointed Deputy Derek Leary to be Minister of State at the Department of the Taoiseach with special responsibility as Government Chief Whip. Senator Pippa Hackett to be Minister of State at the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, and Deputy Hildegard Naughton to be Minister of State at the Department of the Transport, Tourism and Sport. And 7, that on 1st July 2020, on my nomination, the Government appointed Deputy Cleary, in addition to his current responsibilities as Minister of State at the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, with special responsibility for the Gaeltacht, and at the Department of Transport, Tourism and Sport, with special responsibility for sport. Deputy Thomas Byrne is Minister of State at the Department of Taoiseach and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, with special responsibility for European Union affairs. Deputy Patrick O'Donovan is Minister of State at the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, with special responsibility for the Office of Public Works. Deputy Ossian Smith as Minister of State at the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, with special responsibility for public procurement and e-government. Deputy Jack Chambers as Minister of State at the Department of Finance, with special responsibility for financial services, credit unions and insurance. Deputy Josepha Madigan as Minister of State at the Department of Education and Skills, with special responsibility for special education and inclusion. Deputy Martin Hayden as Minister of State at the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, with special responsibility for research and development, farm safety, new market development. Deputy Anne Rabbitt as Minister of State at the Department of Health and the Department of Justice and Equality, with special responsibility for disability. Deputy Colin Brophy as Minister of State at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, with special responsibility for overseas development, aid and the diaspora. Deputy Charlie McConalogue as Minister of State at the Department of Justice and Equality, with special responsibility for law reform. Deputy Joe O'Brien as Minister of State at the Department of Rural and Community Development, with special responsibility for community development and charities. Deputy Peter Burke as Minister of State at the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, with special responsibility for local government and planning. Deputy Malcolm Noonan as Minister of State at the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, with special responsibility for heritage, and at the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, with special responsibility for electoral reform. Deputy Robert Troy as Minister of State at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, with special responsibility for trade promotion. Deputy Damien English as Minister of State at the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection, with special responsibility for employment affairs, and at the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation, with special responsibility for retail businesses. Deputy Mary Butler as Minister of State at the Department of Health, with special responsibility for mental health and older people. Deputy Frank Feehan as Minister of State at the Department of Health, with special responsibility for public health, well-being and national drug strategy. And Deputy Niall Collins as Minister of State at the Department of Education and Skills, with special responsibility for skills and further education. Thank you very much,
Taoiseach. Now we proceed to the order of business. And the House has agreed that for the duration of the COVID-19 emergency only, the Rapporteur's report on the order of business shall not be read out but shall be taken as read. Therefore, in that context, there are just 4 proposals to put to the House today. Number 1 is the proposal for dealing with today's business. Agreed to? Not agreed. Deputy Paul Murphy.
I understand that today Minister Cowan is due to give a personal statement in relation to his drink driving offence, and it's not acceptable for us that he would be able to give a statement and there wouldn't be opportunities for questions from the opposition and answers from the Minister, as was the case, became the precedent really in the last all on numerous different occasions. There are, as Minister Ryan himself said on the radio this morning, numerous questions outstanding relating to the offence itself, relating to the status of his driving licence, relating to whether he was repeatedly in breach of the law in terms of L plates, in terms of accompanied drivers and so on. But the most important question here is the question of precedent. This is the first test of the government and whether they're going to establish a precedent of ministers being involved in controversy and then using their majorities to say that there won't be any questions, we'll just make a statement and that'll be the end of it.
Very clear. Minister Cowan has made a request to me in accordance with Standing Order 56. And that request is to make a personal explanation, to provide a personal explanation to the Dáil. Standing Order 56, which I have acceded to and provided time for him later this evening, specifically precludes a debate or questioning. So this is not unprecedented. In the history of this chamber, there have been numerous statements made in this way. That has been chosen by Deputy Cowan, acceded to me, by me, and that's the end of that particular matter.
Well, it's not, because we have the right to reject the order of business today, based on the precedent of when you had ministerial controversy in the last all, there was very regularly the opportunity for questions and answers. And if you just have a statement and then the Minister leaves and we don't get questions or answers, that is quite problematic from our point of view. So if the Business Committee could go away and come back with a proposal that includes questions and answers, that would be excellent.
Yeah, well, the device being used does not provide for questions and answers, so you're quite entitled to vote against the order of business as proposed. So if the proposal for dealing with today's business is not agreed to, can I ask na Taoiseach Micheál Martin? Could we get a response from the Chief Whip or the... Well, yes. I mean, if the Chief Whip...
I understand that Minister Cowan has made the request through you under the specific standing order. I have no role in that request.
But we can change the order today to facilitate questions and answers. We don't just get...
No, a specific request has been made. I can order under a specific standing order that doesn't apply to government business.
We know that we can change the order of business for today to facilitate questions and answers. So please don't be obstinate about it. You know that you can make a decision now. You can say we accede to this, we'll reschedule the agenda so we can have questions and answers. That's what we need to have some accountability in the House.
The Deputy is correct. But the reality is that we're all aware that between now and the end of July we have critical legislation that we must enact, and we can take time away from the work on that legislation if we choose. It's a matter for the House, entirely a matter for the House, or we can focus on that legislation. It's a matter for yourselves. Yes, Deputy McGrath.
When I attended the Business Committee yesterday, there was no request from Deputy Cowan or from any other group for any time on this, and this is just showboating again and shenanigans. I think that the correct procedure has been used for the statement, and we'll be all waiting to hear it.
Anyone else? No. Okay, na Taoiseach ar tar hef na taris gonna Aberdís tá. Enya tá na gonna Aberdís níl. Is stolim gulen Kestrich. I believe the question is carried. Vote. Would members please take their designated seats, as the vote will be taking place shortly. Number 1 on the order of business. The question is that the proposal for dealing with Tuesday's business be agreed to, and on that question a division has been challenged. Tellers Thaw, Deputies Derek O'Leary and Joe Carey, Neil, Deputies Paul Murphy and Thomas Pringle.
Deputy James Brown. Deputy Jackie Cahill. Minister Derek O'Leary. Deputy Cahill Crowe. Deputy Cormac Devlin. Deputy James Lawless. Taoiseach Micheál Martin. Deputy Paul McAuliffe. Deputy Christopher O'Sullivan. Deputy Niamh Smith. Deputy Joe Carey. Deputy Jennifer Carroll McNeill. Deputy Alan Dillon. Deputy Bernard Durkin. Minister Damien English. Deputy Alan Farrell. Minister Josepha Madigan. Deputy Owen Murphy. Deputy Neil Richmond. Deputy David Stanton. Deputy Patrick Costello. Deputy Francis Noel Duffy. Deputy Marco Cohasey. Deputy David Cullinan.
Neil.
Deputy Pearse Doherty.
Neil.
Deputy Paul Donnelly.
Neil.
Deputy Mairead Farrell.
Neil.
Deputy Claire Curran.
Neil.
Deputy Pádraig McLaughlin.
Neil.
Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald.
Neil.
Deputy Denise Mitchell.
Neil.
Deputy Darren O'Rourke.
Neil.
Deputy Maurice Quinlivan. Deputy Brendan Howland. Deputy Alan Kelly. Deputy Catherine Murphy. Deputy Roisin Shortall. Deputy Paul Murphy. Deputy Cathal Berry. Deputy Peter Fitzpatrick. Deputy Verona Murphy. Deputy Michael Collins. Deputy Matty McGrath. Deputy Michael McNamara. Deputy Thomas Pringle. Neil.
Tá, Trucha, Neil, Caherdeg, you're staying in, nobody abstained. The question is carried and today's business is agreed to. Number 2 is the proposal for dealing with Wednesday's business agreed to. Agreed, thank you. Number 3 is the proposal for dealing with Thursday's business agreed to. Agreed to. And finally is the proposal for dealing with Friday's business agreed to. That's the business of the COVID committee. It's agreed. Thank you very much. We move now to questions on promised legislation. I call on Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald. Remember here, members have 1 minute for a question, 1 minute for an answer. Please.
Thank you, Councillor Taoiseach. The programme for government states that you will reduce the waiting time for assessment of need under the Disability Act of 2005. You're aware, Taoiseach, that parents of children with additional needs are currently before the courts in a bid to obtain this assessment of need for their children within the legally set time frame, which, as you know, is 3 months. I won't comment on individual cases, but you will know that any child who is thought to have additional needs is legally entitled to this assessment within 3 months under the Disability Act. And this time frame is crucial, Taoiseach, because it recognises the absolute importance of early intervention and support. So it is therefore scandalous that 9 out of 10 children who apply for an assessment don't have that assessment completed within the statutory time frame, and some wait for almost up to 2 years. So now the state forces parents into a lengthy, stressful and expensive battles in the court. This isn't new. The state has behaved in this way before. Bridget McCole faced this, Louise O'Keefe faced this, Emma Vic-Vahuna faced this. And Taoiseach, this is an attitude and an approach that absolutely needs to change. So I want to ask you, as Head of Government, will you act now immediately to ensure that no other parent has to go to the courts to achieve and to get the assessment of needs that their child is entitled to within 3 months?
Certainly, I'm of a view that parents should not have to go to court to get the most basic rights for their children. There has been issues ever since that Act was introduced in 2005. Indeed, some sections of that Act, my understanding, has remained to be commenced in respect of children with special needs. Now, in education, in terms of the allocation of resources, it doesn't always now depend on that assessment of need having taken place. But nonetheless, it is very obviously desirable that parents would have an assessment of need carried out so that the best health and education provision can be made for the child. And the incoming government, the new government, the ministers with specific responsibility in this area will work to get the waiting times down significantly, both in terms of assessment of need, also in terms of allocation of places, both in terms of special schools and indeed in mainstream education, and also access to healthcare facilities. That will be a target and an objective of the government.
Alan Kelly.
The proposal for government includes a commitment to prioritise the consolidation of the existing road traffic legislation and to rectify anomalies that exist. So, Taoiseach, I'd like you to deal with the issue I'm about to raise with you fairly quickly, because there is a big anomaly because of COVID. All driver's licences and learner permits which expire before June 30th have been extended by a further 4 months. But full licences that expire from July the 1st onwards have not been extended. However, all learner driver permits that expire between the 1st July and 30th October have also been extended by 4 months. This is a complete anomaly. So people with full licences cannot renew their licence. So, as a temporary measure, will you extend that period like you did with the other licences? Sorry now for bringing up licences again, but at least extend it to the date on which they get their appointment. That may be 4, 5, 6 weeks.
Look, I'll bring that matter to the attention of the Minister for Transport.
It's an anomaly.
Yeah. Yeah, you've helpfully highlighted the anomaly. You've asked for it to be addressed and resolved. From what you're saying here, it makes sense. But I do have to defer to the Minister for Transport in this regard in terms of taking the necessary measures to deal with the anomaly.
Thank you very much, Deputy Jennifer Whitmore.
raise the issue of the extension of maternity leave for new mothers. I acknowledge what you said earlier on today, that 3 of your ministers are currently looking at the issue. But I suppose in light of the fact that it is such an urgent issue, that there are mothers who have had to give up jobs because they cannot access childcare, I'm just wondering, what timescale are your ministers working to? And also, can you give a time when you would expect a decision to be made? Because new mothers in Ireland really need to know where they stand on this issue. Taoiseach.
As I said earlier, the ministers with responsibility for various aspects of this are engaging on the matter. It's somewhat more complex than has been presented in terms of both policy and legal implications, but as soon as possibly can. Obviously, there is a time issue here. I appreciate that. The government will come back with a response.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Mick Barry.
Taoiseach, yesterday off Parnell Place in Cork, there was an 8-hour standoff between Debenhams workers on the one hand and the drivers of trucks and vans on the other, trying to remove stock. A similar standoff is taking place right now as we speak in Blanchardstown. New legislation to protect workers' rights in cases of company liquidation. There's reference to that, page 23, programme for government. My colleague, Deputy Boyd Barrett, raised points about the Duffy-Cahill report. The experience of the Debenhams workers shows, however, that new legislation needs to go further than Duffy-Cahill in 2 urgent regards. I'm asking you to comment. Number 1, the 30-day consultation period has to be meaningful. Workers affected and their representatives need to have full sight of the company books and prompt responses. And secondly, in anticipation of further waves of COVID and the possible reversion to lockdown situations, legislation needs to provide for a suspension, I believe, of liquidations that arise or ostensibly arise from the impact of COVID, in order to permit time and space to examine the option of saving jobs, and I would like the Taoiseach to comment on that.
Thank you very much. Taoiseach.
Yes, in terms of as I said, the legal framework will be examined here in relation to the experience of Debenhams workers and the behaviour of the company involved. And you spoke in terms of the consultation having to be meaningful. It does have to be meaningful. But we will look at the other aspects as well that you've highlighted in terms of full access to the books, if you like, as you have articulated, and all relevant material for workers concerned.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Peter Fitzpatrick.
From a border town in Dundalk, I know the devastating effects that Brexit will have if we don't put in place the necessary measures to deal with. There were many unanswered questions: lack of information available to businesses. Will there be a hard border? Will there be a custom check to the border? What will be the situation with tariffs? How will workers travel from Dundalk to the north and vice versa? Will people be stopped at the border? Will driving licence still be valid in both jurisdictions? Will car insurance still be valid in both jurisdictions? Taoiseach, people are very, very concerned in the border areas. What preparation have you and your government put together to help combat, and there will be a hard border, Taoiseach?
Well, first of all efforts will be made to avoid a no-deal Brexit. The situation is difficult in terms of negotiations between the European Union and the British government. And I did speak to the British Prime Minister. We both agreed that there was a need to comprehensively deal with the issue in a way that would be that should have a comprehensive free trade agreement that would be of benefit to Europe, the United Kingdom and Ireland. And that it was not desirable that there would be a poor Brexit, if you like, and a no-deal Brexit. We also emphasised the need to implement the protocol as it pertains to Northern Ireland, and that what has been agreed to date would be adhered to in any subsequent agreement and in the operation of any post-Brexit scenario. The government will prepare for a number of scenarios, including a no-deal Brexit. We have to prepare for that, and we will work with all the stakeholders and all the companies in that regard.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
In terms of ensuring that people are properly prepared at all levels in all sectors for such eventuality, which we do not desire and we do not want to happen.
Deputy Matthew McGrath.
Many people have been affected by the COVID lockdown, and we've dealt with some of them here today, and indeed I welcome the July provision. But there's a cohort of people out there with young men and women with intellectual disabilities. And I've one in my own, a couple in my own parish, but one story was shared on Facebook, little Jack on Sunday, and it's heart-rending. It's unbelievable. I welcome the July provision, but this cohort of people don't have anything, and their trips to their special schools on the bus with their carers. I salute everybody involved in the boards of management and everybody in the workers and teaching staff. Can you do something, your government do something with the Minister of Disabilities, for this cohort of people who are profoundly affected, and they're locked up and incarcerated in their houses? They need to be able to get out and interact with their other colleagues going to those special schools, and they're very severely impacted. And we can see self-harm, we can see huge impacts, a regress of their progress that they've had in those special schools and special tuition. They need support immediately. They just have been incarcerated for too long, and they're really trapped. Thank you.
Taoiseach.
I would share your distress and concern about this situation. And I would like if you could forward to me the example of the schools in question, or the cohort of students. This year's summer provision, July provision, has been expanded significantly over previous years, both in terms of school-based provision, in terms of home-based provision, in terms of the extension and expansion of DESH schools, for example. And yesterday, the Minister for Education, or Monday, sorry, got sanction from Cabinet to make provision for post-primary children with Down syndrome who had just previously been outside of the scheme, and they're now in a position to participate. So we would be anxious to respond to any cohort of children who, for one reason or another, as you have articulated, do not have access to the July provision. So I'd appreciate it maybe if you could send on the details to my office.
Michael McNamara.
Thank you. The Programme for Government recognises the huge value of our aviation sector in supporting economic development, international connectivity and tourism via our airports. In July 18, you said of Shane Ross, the former Minister for Transport, "I don't think he gets the regions. Both Shannon and Cork have a huge role to play if we are to be serious about rebalancing the state." Taoiseach, today Shannon Airport is calling for redundancies. Shannon heritage sites, some of them are closed, others are closing at the end of August. There is no balanced regional development. The same company is maintaining sites open in Dublin. Taoiseach, I want to know when you're going to bring in legislation to rebalance our aviation sector and ensure that we have balanced development across that sector.
Well, in terms of specific legislation in relation to aviation, that's not in the short term on the agenda, but certainly your point in relation to regional balance in terms of economic development is part and parcel and at the centre of the programme for government. We do need to have reorder the economic balance within the country, in my view. Aviation is in difficulty because of COVID-19, and there's no getting away from that. Travel advisories in relation to the COVID and the advice that one should not travel will have an impact. But public safety comes first. On the heritage sites, there should be room to deal with that, and there should be a capacity to deal with that, particularly since we are encouraging people to holiday at home, staycation, and so forth. Therefore, quite a number of facilities can be made available for people to enjoy.
All right,
I would have thought, as you have outlined.
Deputy Michael Collins.
On page 61 in the programme for government, you state that access to high-quality broadband across Ireland is essential to the development of all parts of our country. Taoiseach, you may have seen on national TV and paper reports in the past few weeks that Gagan west of Bandon has little or no broadband. Areas in Kinsale, Bandon, Clonakilty, all the way back to the three peninsulas in West Cork have similar nightmares. The previous Minister for Communication recently, due to COVID-19, allowed extra capacity to broadband and mobile phone companies to help people who live in rural communities access broadband and phone services. And strangely enough, not one area that had issues in West Cork that I am aware of got extra services due to this extra capacity being given, leading to the question where in rural Ireland was the extra capacity rolled out. Taoiseach, there are so many who can work at home today but are unable. The people of Gagan, like many more in West Cork, are subjected to spending their day in a church car park so they can work. Taoiseach, what can I tell the people of Gagan and Bandon and other parts of West Cork? Will they get a broadband service immediately, or will they have to continue going to the church car park for broadband?
Taoiseach.
I think, obviously, historically, we've been under-provided for in terms of broadband in rural Ireland. That said, the programme for government is committed to rolling out the National Broadband Contract, which has been agreed by the previous government, and the indications are they may be in a position, the company may be in a position to accelerate some dimensions of that plan. The objective is to get broadband rolled out as quickly as possible, and the Minister will be looking at hubs, for example, in certain locations that may facilitate people from rural areas to access and get quicker and more effective access and greater connectivity. So, to answer your question, I can't promise you something immediately, but it is very high on the government agenda to roll out the broadband plan as fast as possible, and to do so also in a way that could give communities more quicker access than maybe was previously envisaged.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Pierce Doherty.
To the government to working with the banking industry to support customers during and after the COVID crisis. Taoiseach, you'll be well aware that the banks are actually charging a COVID penalty where thousands of euro additional will have to be paid by mortgage holders who avail of this break. You will also probably be aware that on the 11th of May, the Taoiseach, the Minister for Finance and the then Minister for Enterprise met with the head of the 5 retail banks. At that meeting, and I've read the minutes, I have them here, the CEO of Bank of Ireland claimed that charging of interest accrued during mortgage payment breaks was required by the regulator. The CEO of AIB said unless the additional interest was charged, loans would go into default and credit rating of customers would be impacted. Jeremy Masding of Permanent TSB said the approach being taken which was required to prevent the loans from being considered going into default. Now, I questioned the Governor of the Central Bank this morning at the COVID-19 committee. All those claims are false, untrue, misinformation. That has been clarified by the Governor of the Central Bank. I knew that at the time. What surprises me is the Minister for Finance, the Taoiseach, or the Minister for Enterprise didn't know. So I ask you, what are you going to do when state-owned banks are misinforming the Minister for Finance and the Taoiseach at the time? And are you actually going to take a step to actually support and prevent ordinary customers from being ripped off, as has happened in Germany, Spain, and Luxembourg, and Belgium, and other areas where legislation was introduced?
I think the statement of the Central Bank Governor this morning is very revealing, important, and I think we'll have to inform future interactions with the pillar banks. And my understanding is the Minister for Finance will be assessing that statement of the Governor of the Central Bank and then determining policy after that in terms of his interactions with the banks.
Maurice Quinlivan.
Hola. Taoiseach, yesterday on Cork Radio you spoke of a letter you received. I understand the former Taoiseach, now Taoiseach, received it, and the Minister for Education received it as well, from Louise O'Keefe, and about her the graduate scheme that was set up for survivors of day school abuse in the state. Taoiseach, you'll be well aware,
as a result of
So I'm asking the Taoiseach to deliver on funding, and can we take the Minister's word that funding to be provided to deliver that in Crossroads?
First of all, the Minister's yourself clear it's obviously something that we look at.
Thank you very much.
But that page 2 of the programme for government states that government will do the best possible to protect friends and family in nursing homes. Yesterday we heard the harrowing account of the treatment of one nursing home resident in County Meath and the condition in which he was transferred to Connolly Hospital, where he later passed away, Ultan Meehan. In early June, I raised this case with the then Minister for Health, Simon Harris, with HICWA and with the HSE, and it's very apparent that the monitoring of private nursing homes falls between cracks and that the system is totally inadequate. I believe a full independent investigation is needed in this case, but in the sector more broadly, we need robust safeguarding legislation, and we need legislation to improve clinical governance, and I think that's agreed across the board. I want to know from the Taoiseach what your plans are in relation to this. Does it involve expanding the role of HICWA or expanding the role of the HSE?
Yeah, I dealt with that. I dealt with that earlier. HICWA is the regulating authority. In my view, we should compile a report on this and should ensure that the family of ultimately a comprehensive account of what happened to deal with the terrible anguish that they have experienced to date, and that Mrs. Meehan in particular has experienced.
Deputy Donegal, Lira.
Taoiseach, I raise with you today the issues facing a small category of people, but facing a fairly significant injustice all the same. The Irish Times reported yesterday about Finn Robertson, 17, from Dungarvan, who will not receive an estimated grade for politics as he was self-taught. He now believes he won't get the points he needs to study politics and journalism in UL. I also want to give you the example of Kinga Salaj, who wants to study medicine. She completed her Leaving Cert last year. While she received good points, it was not enough for medicine, so she taught herself at home via homeschool and mathstutor.ie because she couldn't afford grinds. She got her HPAT results. It was excellent in the 92nd percentile, but because she does not qualify for a calculated grade, she will now miss out on the opportunity to study medicine despite excellent HPAT results. So, Taoiseach, first of all, I want to ask you, do you accept that these students are facing an injustice? And secondly, will you engage with these students to try and find a solution for them so that they don't miss out on third-level places through no fault of their own?
Yes, well, I will engage with the department and maybe one has to be very balanced here. In relation to leaving certificates and allocation of third-level places, there are a lot of competing rights. So what you do in one area, whilst affirming and helping people, could have an unintended consequence of undermining the rights of others in terms of access to places, be it in medicine or be it in other. That's a general point I would make. And I think when the whole issue of grading and estimated grades emerged as the solution, clearly problems were going to emerge as a result of that. That said, mechanisms do exist within the third-level sector in particular to facilitate access for students in specific backgrounds or contexts, be it in the DARE project or others. So I will have to engage with education to see if some resolution can be found. You're essentially talking about homeschooled or home-taught students. But I know from experience there is no easy answer to it either, because in terms of we can do it, of course we can engage.
Okay, well,
but in terms of the allocation of places,
can't have a further debate on Deputy Paul Donnelly.
In the programme for government, there's a promise to continue to resource harm reduction education awareness programmes and increase awareness of risk of drug use and contribution of drugs to criminality. As someone who's worked in that area for the last 20 years, there has been a massive increase in drug use, a massive increase in criminality, and a number of younger people getting involved in it. And could I ask Taoiseach to indicate if there will be a structured link between schools and local youth drug services? Because at the moment there isn't. It's ad hoc and it's up to whatever particular individual principal or school, and I think it needs to be structured as well. Could I also ask if the community sector will be involved in a public awareness programme? Because at the end of the day, we're on the ground. The people who are involved in tackling drugs and crime within the community are on the ground. We understand what's happening, when it's happening.
Thank you, Deputy. 2 points I would make. I will work to see can we develop a structured link. The more critical point is within school curriculum and school programmes that there are very strong self-esteem and self-respect modules of learning to enable young people to be strong enough within their peer groups to resist the temptation or to resist being lured into behaviour which is injurious to them and damaging to them. And I'm a great believer in that whole idea of inculcating in young people self-respect and self-esteem from the earliest of ages. That's the best protection we can give our children. But equally, I'm very conscious of what you were saying. I think it is a very serious issue for us as a society, and there are measures in the programme for government to deal with it. One area we're very anxious, for example, is that the school completion programme will come back within the Department of Education to integrate better with our education structures, so that we can, if we maintain children in school longer, we have a better chance of keeping them away from harm.
Taoiseach, our forestry sector has a huge part to play in our whole climate change strategy, and this sector has been bedevilled with troubles over the last number of years. Our targets, we're only meeting around 50% of our targets for planting, and with huge difficulty in obtaining licence for thinning, felling and plantation. We have had a McKinley report commissioned, and I would like to know what is the time frame for the delivery of this McKinley report that hopefully will rectify some of the problems within the sector.
I thank Deputy Micheál for raising this issue. It is an extremely challenging one. It's urgent because, without question, it's having an impact on construction in terms of supply of timber itself. But the delays in terms of licence applications for felling and planting are simply unacceptable and not sustainable into the future. And in terms of I've asked the Minister to expedite action in this regard, and also to see what measures are required to get a move on in terms of getting rid of these logjams that are there at the moment.
4 more deputies. If you take 30 seconds, maybe rather than 60, we get everyone in. Deputy Jed Nash.
Thank you very much, Corla. Taoiseach, the July stimulus package is very eagerly awaited by working people and by businesses right across the country who I think are anxious to see the colour of this government's money. Could you state clearly, Taoiseach, that in the first instance, when you intend precisely to present the July stimulus, and will you commit to presenting it to this chamber? I think it's important that that's done rather than launch such a significant state investment outside of this House. It is important that we debate the contents of July stimulus in this House. Pardon? Thank you. Yeah. And could I ask you finally, just in terms of the legislation that's required to give effect to July stimulus, which pieces of legislation will require amendment, and which pieces of new legislation will be required to give effect to your ambitions under the July stimulus?
Well, first of all, I would hope within the next 3 weeks we certainly will have the July stimulus, maybe within the next fortnight. The Taoiseach, the Minister of Finance, Public Expenditure, myself and others are working in relation to it right now, and there will be a special Cabinet Committee this week will meet to go through the detail of the July stimulus itself, and obviously it will have to be debated in the House, and there will be legislation that I think will underpin it. I think the Financial Provisions COVID Bill, while I can't go through it all, I think I went through it earlier, that doesn't relate specifically to the stimulus, but obviously will underpin it. The Micro Enterprise Loan Agreement Bill will help. The Credit Guarantee Amendment Bill of 220 would be of assistance as well. And the we're looking at a company amendment bill in terms of dealing with some immediate problems for companies in relation to acute issues arising from COVID.
All right. To expedite matters, I'll take the final 3 questions and then we'll go to the Taoiseach for response. Deputy Richmond.
Just to build further on the exchange between Taoiseach and Deputy Fitzpatrick, previously in this House, the Minister for Foreign Affairs highlighted that a new Brexit omnibus bill would be needed in light of the current state of negotiations. And can I ask the Taoiseach when we may expect that bill, and indeed what, if any, communication will be had between the Government and our friends in the Northern Irish Executive?
Thank you very much. Deputy Paul Murphy.
The programme for government on page 10 says we will complete the review of the school transport scheme to seek better outcomes and reduce car journeys. But it appears that while that review is ongoing, a very widespread cut of Dublin bus contracted school buses in Dublin is taking place. I know that in 3 schools at least in my constituencies, in one 4 buses are being cut and another 7 buses are being cut, and it appears to be a Dublin-wide cut, which would therefore affect thousands of students and their parents, leaving students in a situation of either having to take regular buses and transfer, which obviously in the context of COVID-19, or the parents have to drive them, defeating the point of the whole bus process.
authority, which I raised and he raised previously in relation to the manner in which various lenders treat their customers. Could I ask the Taoiseach if it might be possible at this stage to establish some kind of common ground whereby all the lending institutions treat their customers equally under the same rules, and at the same time, might it be possible to try to get parity with our European colleagues in relation to the interest rates charged?
Just in relation to nursing homes and the shocking case that happened to my own constituency, to a constituent of mine who died in a nursing home in Meath quite recently, and the facts of the death are quite shocking. You might have read them in the paper. The individual had an open wound due to tumours on his face.
Already been raised, Deputy.
Had to be brought into hospital. But just there needs to be an investigation into what's happened in nursing homes in general during this COVID crisis. And so far, this individual, the family haven't got an investigation from HICWA, from the HSE, or from the Department of Health. Will you commit to having an investigation?
Deputy O'Dowd, the same matter. Are you on?
If you would consider appointing a consultant geriatrician to investigate that nursing home, as indeed further new cases have now been brought to light, which are very concerning in that particular nursing home. I think it needs it urgently and as soon as possible, notwithstanding the HICWA investigation.
Is it on the same matter? No. Briefly, go ahead.
Thank you, Ken Corda. Taoiseach, congratulations, first of all, on attaining your new office. Taoiseach, you'll be aware the commuter belt requires significant investments in rail carriages, rolling stock and commuter services. I know the new programme for government has much along those lines. Perhaps you might outline the plans to bring the Cadet Route project and other projects into the commuter belt, the rail projects into the commuter belt, and investment in rolling stock and new carriages.
Thank you very much. As over time, Taoiseach, could ask you maybe you'd correspond with the deputies by way of a response, could you?
Of course.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Then we move on. Item number 4A is the Industrial Relations Sectoral Employment Orders Confirmation Bill. It's in the name of Deputy Jed Nash. Can I ask Deputy Jed Nash to propose the bill's introduction?
I move and I propose to introduce the bill. If I can.
Is the bill being opposed? Deputy Cleary, are you opposing this bill? We're not. Okay. The motion for leave to introduce is therefore agreed. Can I ask Deputy Nash if you'd address this bill for a few minutes? You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ken Corla. I formally move the bill. Just for the information of the House, a recent High Court judgment struck down the SEO system for the electoral contracting sector and also the statutory framework for other such orders as set out in Chapter 3 of the Industrial Relations Amendment Act 2015. The judgment, in my view, has had a chilling effect on the conduct of industrial relations in this country. In my view, it is a far-reaching judgment, and there may be consequences outside of the immediate subject area of the actual bill. In my view, Taoiseach, the judgment must be appealed to the Supreme Court because there are very significant issues of public interest at hand here. Since 1908, as you will know, Taoiseach, under the Old Trade Boards Act and later under an Act of the Oireachtas enacted in 1946, it's been the policy of this state to provide a framework for sectoral collective bargaining to promote decent pay and terms and conditions above the statutory basic minima in areas of the economy that were susceptible to low pay, to exploitation, and where trade union density may be patchy or non-existent. Chapter 3 of the 2015 Act and the SEO system, which is the subject of the recent High Court ruling that was deemed to be in conflict with Bunnock na Heron, was designed to address deficiencies in terms of the role of the Oireachtas in the making of the formal registered employment agreements, as found in what is known as the McGowan judgment of 2013. And the High Court has now judged in the NECI and the Labour Court, Minister for Business Enterprise and Innovation and Attorney General case that, in essence, the Minister and the Labour Court are exercising the legislative power of the state by making laws giving effect to the terms of the three purported sectoral employment orders without being the Oireachtas. So the Industrial Relations SEO's Confirmation Bill 2020 seeks to immediately remedy this defect by giving statutory effect to the recommendations of three purported sectoral employment orders covering tens of thousands of electricians, construction workers across all kinds of grades and categories in that sector, and indeed mechanical engineers and related disciplines too. So in other words, the terms of these three orders that were struck down essentially by the High Court can be, under this proposed legislation, converted into primary law with the blessing of both houses of the Oireachtas to address some of these significant defects identified by the High Court. The programme for government, Taoiseach, is virtually silent, sadly, on the whole question of workers' rights and the advancement of workers' rights. The State Census Foundation has expressed it to be desirable that there should be space to allow unions and employers to engage on sectorally applicable and enforceable agreements across entire economic sectors in order to support the principle of decent work, avoid a damaging race to the bottom and promote a level playing pitch for good compliant businesses. And this bill, I think, continues in that tradition. Its ambitions have the support, Taoiseach, of the trade union movement. It's urgent for tens of thousands of workers across the construction sector and related disciplines and for our economy. And I'm hopeful, Taoiseach, that your government will see fit to support this legislation when it is tabled for second stage debate shortly.
The motion for leave to is agreed, and the debate is adjourned in accordance with standing orders for the next day on which private members' business is to be taken. And congratulations indeed on your being the person to bring forward the first piece of private members' business. The order for second stage would be taken in private members' time. That's agreed. Agreed? Yeah, we've agreed. Okay. Thank you very much. We move now to item number 5, which is a motion regarding sittings of the Dáil. I call on the Government Chief Whip, Deputy Derek O'Leary, to move the motion. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. A motion regarding Standing Order 28. This is to provide for an additional government representative on the Business Committee. Is this agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. Rockamy the Raig and Shin Gadi and Kate Piece of Gano Ella, Buinin Shashol in a Mastercoin. What? Oh, we're taking a sus. Sus in issue for Fehinomate. Okay? Gurmaga ver fad.
the motions for the revised estimates for the
Yeah,
public services, vote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6.
I so move. Yeah.
Thank you, Taoiseach. So we'll start 20 minutes.
I move that a sum not exceeding 221,732,000 be granted to defray the charge which will come in course of payment during the year ending on the 31st day of December 2020 for the salaries and expenses and for certain grants of the offices in the Taoiseach's vote group. The group of votes which we are discussing today involves my department and 5 others. While I have certain responsibilities to the Oireachtas for administrative matters in some of these offices, they operate independently of my department. I will firstly briefly outline what is involved with the other votes and then address in greater detail those. Vote 1, the President's establishment. The estimate for the President's establishment is 4.5 million. This includes some €3 million for pay and administration, with the balance to fund the centenarian's bounty. Vote 3, the Office of the Attorney General. The estimate for the Office of the Attorney General is 16.18 million. Of this, just over €12 million relates to staff costs and almost 2.45 million is allocated to the Law Reform Commission. The Central Statistics Office is vote 4, and the Central Statistics Office plays a vital role in the functioning of the state and providing independent and verifiable data on a broad range of topics, including social, economic and environmental issues. In a world where alternative facts are regularly circulated to try and distort debates, institutions such as the CSO are becoming ever more important in providing the essential foundation of expertise to underpin policy. In recent months, the CSO has taken a lead in gathering data relevant to understanding and overcoming the impact of COVID-19 on our society and economy. It has also moved rapidly to adapt its methodologies, and its work will be fundamental as we plan for a recovery which benefits all of our people. The estimate for the Central Statistics Office is €65.7 million and provides funding for additional cyclical work, in particular for the delivery of a census of agriculture in 2020 and planning for next year's full census of population. Vote 5 relates to the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, and the estimate for that office is €43.97 million. The vote provides for fees to counsel, costs awarded against the state arising under legal proceedings, and the cost of the local state solicitor service. Vote 6, the estimate for the Chief State Solicitor's Office is €37.4 million, salaries, the bulk of which relates to administration and salaries. Vote 2 then, the Department of the Taoiseach. The largest provision in this group of votes relates to my department, for which the estimate is just over €54 million. Roughly 41% relates to staff and administration. This funding is intended to enable my department to play a unique role in coordinating government and leading on certain critical issues. The programme for government sets out transformative policies on the full range of issues of concern to the Irish people, starting with urgent action for social and economic recovery from the COVID-19 crisis and continuing with action on health, housing, climate change and education. The 3 parties to this government have jointly committed to a programme of sustained action. In order to deliver this, we need a new approach to managing government. We've begun establishing a series of new cabinet committees which will mark a significant departure. They will cover more topics, they will meet more regularly, they will allow much deeper engagement with policy development and oversight of delivery. They will ensure that all relevant departments take responsibility for their roles in delivering priorities, rather than placing sole responsibility on a single lead department. Reflecting its new roles and the priorities set out by government, a new departmental strategy statement will be published in the coming months. The Department of the Taoiseach has taken a central role in coordinating the state's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and this will continue to be an overriding priority for as long as is necessary. We are only just beginning to understand the full impact of the pandemic, and we continue to face new challenges as we work to control the spread of the virus, treat it effectively and move towards recovery. In the 5th month of an unprecedented national effort, and with 3 steps of the reopening plan implemented, we cannot simply let our guard down. We are reopening, but this reopening absolutely requires us all to continue to act to control the possible spread of the virus. When people ignore basic precautions by gathering in large numbers with no social distancing, no masks and no hygiene measures, they represent a direct threat to the control of the virus. I don't intend providing a running commentary on major instances where guidelines have been breached, and all of the evidence is that the vast majority of people continue to act responsibly. But let no one be in any doubt, the virus has not been defeated, and we must all continue to play our part. I think we also need to understand that there are still many in our society who are vulnerable and many who are fearful. All of the economic and social research available to us confirms that the impact of this crisis is not being felt equally. We must do everything possible to protect those who are vulnerable and to help those who are suffering other impacts, such as to their mental health. The first step in showing continued solidarity is to accept the restrictions which remain in place. My department has taken the lead in key elements of the public communication challenge of ensuring that we all know what is happening and what is required of each of us. This represents the largest unanticipated cost in these estimates. The focus of the public awareness programme to date has been to build mass awareness and understanding of key information related to the COVID-19 emergency response as quickly and efficiently as possible. The approach is aligned with both World Health Organization and European Centre for Disease Control advice. The scale of the effort required to reach as many people as possible with regular messages to raise awareness and build public support for the collective effort required has necessitated a significant spend. A provision of €20 million for this work is included in the 2020 revised estimates. In the early stages, this involved providing information to the public on the various restrictions as they were implemented and the wide range of business supports, social welfare supports and community supports available. Targeted campaigns have addressed specific issues such as social distancing and the leaving certificate. At the moment, the emphasis is on explaining under each phase of the roadmap for reopening of society and business as they come into effect. The public awareness campaigns have cost €10.5 million to date. Comprehensive public communications with broad media reach will continue to be run for as long as is necessary to inform on crucial public health guidance. My intention is that we will, in the coming weeks, specifically review the most effective messages for the task of making sure that people both take advantage of reopening steps and continue to take essential precautions. People must understand that until there is an available and widely administered vaccine, full normality is not going to happen. I would like us all to note that in a free democracy such as ours, the independent media is the principal channel of communication with the public during a major emergency such as this. I want to acknowledge the commitment of journalists to covering this crisis in often stressful circumstances and also for asking the tough questions essential to challenging us to be more effective. In the government's first week in office, our two overriding priorities have been to take decisions relating to the control of the virus and to rapidly commence work on an initiative to address the devastating economic impact of the pandemic. We have been reviewing work by the Department of Finance on high-frequency data on economic activity to try to get a level of understanding of the current situation. Overall, the data shows that many sectors are seeing a strong rebound as the reopening of the economy has moved forward. However, we're also seeing that other sectors are stabilising at a lower level and that this could become a new normal unless we act. We will act, and we will do so with urgency. An investment-led jobs and recovery initiative is being developed and will be finalised in the coming weeks. Our priority will be to protect businesses and jobs which are still struggling and need help to be able to first survive and then compete as the international economic situation improves. Later in the year, we will also produce a new economic plan. This plan will detail how we will secure a strong and dynamic economy, prepare workers and businesses for the challenges and changes of the future, enhance our skills base, retrain and support workers to seize new opportunities, and bring about the transformation in our economy that the crisis of climate change demands. This work will be overseen by the Cabinet Committee on Economic Recovery and Investment, which we established last week. I intend that this government will build further on Ireland's record of being an effective and active participant within the European Union and international organisations. This is a grave moment in world history. Those of us who believe in free democracy and cooperation between nations cannot stand on the sidelines while they are under attack. As is signalled in the programme for government, we will be promoting the strengthening of the European Union and the extension of its ability to be a driver of progress and a protector of core values. We will implement a whole-of-government approach to cross-cutting European Union and international issues, such as the Sustainable Development Goals and international trade. We will also take a seat on the UN Security Council for a 2-year term from 2021-2022. This gives Ireland another opportunity to advance our foreign policy objectives and values and influence decisions that impact the lives of millions of the most vulnerable of the world's citizens. We will continue to increase the scope and impact of Ireland's global footprint in terms of diplomacy, culture, business, official development assistance, tourism and trade. As part of the European Union institutional change over last year, EU heads of state and government agreed a new strategic agenda to guide European Union policy, ambition and budgets over the next number of years. The scale and urgency of many issues has evolved rapidly